Now, before we move on to the update PHP as part of crud, I just want to clarify something. So according to Stack Overflow, which is the holy bible of programming and other things computer related, you don't need to actually close the database connection all the time like we have here. So I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit and close it when we've finished using it at the end of the page rather than all the time. Where is it again? There it is. I'll leave it there. So we've only got one function to close the connection to the database now. So we'll go back to include once. Anyway, what we're going to do obviously is update. So when I click edit, at the moment nothing happens, but what we want to happen is we want it to populate this this form with the items that exist in that row where we've pressed edit, so that, for example, we only have to edit one little thing. We can just edit the quantity, for example, and we don't have to rewrite the product name and stuff like that, which is a bit easier. And we also want that save button to turn into an update button to differentiate between creating a new product or updating an existing one. So let's just go back to the page as it was and have a look at the code. We'll need to do that. So at the moment, our form for saving or saving a new product or editing an existing one is here in terms of our HTML. What we can actually do is specify a value for these inputs that appears when the page loads. For example, let's just do one as a test. And you can see there it populates. However, I don't want it to do that. I want it to populate when I press edit. So what I'm going to actually need is a bunch of variables, and they're initially going to start with nothing in them, but they're going to end up with the data that's in the table, the products table, in them, and then be populated into this HTML form here. So I'll just set that up ready to work on as we get to it. And then I'll go about creating the empty variables for that at the top of the page in our PHP. So when page loads, we'll create those now. And I can actually use these variable names here, because those variables there, they're going to be different to the ones I'm creating now, but they're only created when we click save. So it's okay if we use the same variable name in this case, I think. Let's hope that doesn't cause any issues. Who knows? We'll see, I guess. And as I said, they're going to be initially set to nothing or empty quotes to initialize them if you like. And obviously, when the page loads, they're going to populate the form, but if they're empty, then it'll appear as if there's nothing in them, which is what we want to do. So that looks okay. Now we need to echo what's in those variables we've just created in these values here using some PHP, and we'll echo product name, for example. And just make sure that actually works. Should have nothing there, yep. And we'll do the same for the rest. So I'll supplier ID, category ID, unit, price, and finally quantity. Hopefully no errors. Good, that's good. So now we want to give those variables values when we click the edit button. Okay, so we'll chuck that in before delete, because in our acronym crud, it comes before delete. So we'll say if is set edit. In other words, if the button's been clicked, the edit button, and that button is called edit. Essentially, we want to give those variables we just created at the top, we want to give them values, but they're going to get their values from the database, and for that particular row. So we're going to write a select query because we need to get that row for where they've clicked edit. And it'll be select all from products, and it'll be where product ID is equal to our hidden ID, which, remember, is how we get which button has been clicked. So we actually need to create our hidden ID now, and that is equal to, remember, request hidden ID, as it is in the delete down here, which I've done below in the delete as well. We want to execute that query, and put the results in an array. We don't need to loop through it, however. So we're going to go result equals MySQLi query, and we're running on the connection, we're running SQL select. And a row will be equal to putting it in an array. And that's the result we're putting into an array, the result object, which means we can now, for example, set product name to what is in the database at this particular index, or in our results at the index of product name. Let's just echo. No, we don't need to do that. Let's test that. It should appear in the form when we hit edit on them, and you can see there it does, which is awesome. So that's working so far. Let's go ahead and do the others. So what was it? Supplier ID, and that's equal to row supplier ID from the database. Category ID is equal to row category ID from the database. What's next? Unit is equal to unit in the database. Price is equal to price from the database. And finally, quantity is equal to quantity from the database, which now should populate our form when we click edit. It does. Excellent. Next thing we need to do is change our button from save to update. Now to do that, we can change the name and value of the button in our form, depending on whether it should be save or update. So let's create a variable to do that, like we did with these empty variables here, and then echo it into the form control. So let's call it VTN name. And at first it should be save when we load the page. And we'll echo that out here. So let's echo that out here. It's called btn name and it's called save at first. The only issue is when we change what appears on the button is it's going to be lowercase, which doesn't look great. You could probably find a way to do it uppercase easily by changing it from lowercase s in our variable to uppercase and then here as well. That wasn't as hard as I imagined. So let's test that. It still works. Looks all good. Yep, so it's save at the moment. So now we want to say if they click edit, we want to change the button from save to update. Which means if we reload the page, it goes to update. Just to demonstrate that once more really quickly. It's on save when we load the page and it allows us to obviously insert new record. Click edit and it turns into update, which we now need to program. So we need now to check whether that update button has been clicked in PHP, and if it has, we need to update the row for this product ID with the information that's in this HTML form. So essentially it's overriding what's already in the database at that record or at the position in the database, but if you change anything, obviously it looks like it's updated, so it sort of does the same thing. So let me just put a comment here to keep it consistent. So user clicks edit. All right, so here we'll say user clicks update. Oops. And we'll go if, once again, is set. You should be getting pretty used to doing this by now. If is set, update capital U this time, because remember our button value, or name rather, is capital S or capital U, depending on whether it's save or update, just so it appears better on the button. So if they press update, we need to get what's in the form once again, and then insert it into the database. And we've done that when we go save. So let's just do it that way. And again, we'll actually take all of that, I think, and just have a look through and make sure that it's going to work. So obviously the SQL is going to be different. I'm going to delete the SQL and change it to SQL update, and that's going to be equal to something very shortly. We'll do a test in MySQL. Product updated. Again, if they, I mean, it's pre-populating the form here, but if they happen to delete one and leave it empty, then we can do that validation again, which I don't see any problem with doing that. All right, so all we've got to do is write the SQL. Let's change it, something about it. And it'll be where the product ID is 1, so let's go update product set product name equals chase supplier ID equals, what's the supplier ID of chase? 1 and 1. Category ID equals 1. Unit is 10 boxes times 20 bags. We'll leave it all the same except the quantity, shall we? Unit equals, in quotes, remember? Is that 0? No, it should be 10 boxes. price, we'll leave it as 18, and we'll change the quantity to 100. And our where clause is where the product ID equals 1. Let's test that. Obviously that product ID is going to change depending on where we press edit. We're just testing how SQL works at the moment. And that looks all good. Just browse it and make sure, yep, our quantity is up to 100. Let's go back to refresh this and it's on 100. So that's still working. Our read is still working. And we can chuck in our SQL here and clean it up. So our product name is not going to be from there, it's going to be from here. And our supplier ID is from here, or in other words, what's in the form as well. All of these are from the form where the user is updating everything, obviously, as well. Price is from the form, quantity is from the form, and where product ID is equal to the button that was clicked, which we haven't got yet. So what we actually need is the hidden ID again. You might be wondering why I'm recreating this every time, which is a good question. Essentially, every time we click a button on the page, it's refreshing the page and submitting the form, or vice versa, which means this hidden ID variable is not going to be created at all when our page loads, because it only is created when we click something on the page. Now, if all goes to plan, that's not actually going to work, which I'll explain shortly. But anyway, let's test changing the quantity of this first one back to 45 and hitting update. It says product updated because they filled out all the form data, but it didn't actually update. The SQL failed, and that's because there's an undefined index hidden ID. And as I was just explaining, that's because when the page loads, that hidden ID is reset or non-existent because it's only created when the button is clicked. So the issue is when we press edit, this hidden ID variable is created based on, or depending on which button they press edit on. Just to demonstrate that, let's go to crud and press edit. You can see there its hidden ID has a value. If we press update, you look through here, you can't see hidden ID at all, which means when we press update and the page reloads, hidden ID does not exist. And I'll talk about combating that in a second, but if you have a look at our form that actually has the update button, there's no hidden input type or form control here for that hidden ID. So the best way around that, in case you haven't already guessed, is using a session variable to store the hidden ID, because session variables are they're persistent. No matter whether you're refreshing the page or not, which is going to be handy for things like this and other things. So what we need to do is actually here, when they press edit, we need to create a session variable rather than just a basic variable, if you like. And we'll call it hidden ID. And it's equal to where they've clicked the button on the form or in the table of products. And now this hidden ID, oops, we also need to set hidden ID here to session variable. And now we'll set this hidden ID to session variable as well. And we'll also complete our SQL query. That hidden ID value there. We'll test it. And hopefully, if we try and update chase quantity 45 and press update, it will update, and it has. Excellent. So that concludes our sort of mini series on creating, reading, updating and deleting it from the database for staff. Remember, the whole purpose of this page was so that staff can manipulate the database or change the database and update it without the need for this interface, because obviously you don't want the staff who aren't web developers or database administrators using this interface and potentially destroying the database.